The storm had begun before sunrise, swallowing the horizon of Illyria 7 in a white tempest that made the air itself roar. Inside the training dome, every wall trembled under the pressure of the wind. The cadets, 6 species in total, had been told that the dome was designed to withstand anything short of a full polar cyclone. Yet as the wind keened through the metal frame and frost crawled inward like living veins, the promise of safety began to crack. The temperature readout fell faster than anyone wanted to admit. At first, the glowing blue panels of the heat grid flickered only slightly, as though the power core needed a moment to catch its breath. But then, in the span of a single heartbeat, the light died completely. The dome plunged into darkness so complete that even the bioluminescent skin of the amphibian cadets dulled to a frightened gray. Evan Hale had seen power failures before, but not in conditions like this. The air pressure dropped sharply, and a rush of cold came from the vents, no longer carrying warmth, but the metallic tang of frozen ozone. His breath turned to vapor immediately, curling before his face like ghosts. Around him, confusion broke into panic. One of the avian cadets, feathers slick with frost, cried out that her wing joints were stiffening. An insectoid cadet beat his clawed arms together, trying to create friction heat, but the chitin only cracked. The amphibians had it worst. Their skin was freezing from the surface inward, their bodies designed for humid jungles, not the raw cruelty of Illyria 7's polar region. Every second that passed felt like a countdown. Evan moved through the chaos with the kind of calm that wasn't instinctive but practiced. His visor fogged from inside, but he ignored it, checking the power junction first. The small auxiliary lights on the console blinked red. Core malfunction, probably due to ice intrusion into the fusion regulator. He tapped the casing, listening for the faint hum of the backup cells, but heard only silence. Outside, the storm roared as if mocking the dome's artificial arrogance. He could feel the cold seeping through his gloves now, biting into his bones. He knew that if he waited for a rescue signal, the entire class would be dead within hours. The Academy's protocols assumed that humans, with their inefficient thermoregulation and fragile lungs, would be the first to succumb. He almost laughed at that thought. If there was one thing humans had learned over millennia, it was how to survive when the world wanted them gone. One of the instructors, a tall, scaled reptilian, called out over the comms, his voice distorted by static. "Remain calm. The emergency team will arrive before dusk." Evan looked at the man's trembling claws and knew he was lying. Dusk on Illyria 7 was nearly 10 hours away. No one could last that long with the dome dead. He turned his attention instead to the others. The avian cadet named Sierra was trying to warm her feathers with a low-voltage power cell, holding it too close until smoke began to rise from her hand. Evan snatched it away before she burned herself. "You'll need that for navigation later," he said simply. She stared at him with wide, glassy eyes, unable to process the calm in his tone. Around them, frost began to bloom on the interior walls, spreading like white fire. He took a step back and drew a deep breath, the air cutting like knives in his throat. The first priority was to assess the structure's integrity. The dome was built for observation, not habitation. Its insulation relied entirely on powered heat circulation. Once the energy source was gone, the dome became little more than a metal shell, a trap that held the cold inside as effectively as it had once kept it out. The wind outside screamed again, and a sheet of snow slammed against the transparent ceiling. The sound of cracking glass echoed through the air, sharp and final. A few of the cadets shrieked. Evan didn't. He crouched low and pressed his gloved palm to the ground. Beneath the frost, he could feel subtle tremors, vibrations from shifting snowdrifts outside. That meant the wind was carving deep patterns into the ice, shaping the land itself. Those patterns would be the key. He straightened and made a decision. "We can't stay in here," he said, loud enough for the group to hear. "This dome is a coffin now." The insectoid cadet hissed in disbelief. "You want to go outside? Into that?" Evan nodded once. Out there, the wind is dangerous. In here, it's death. He grabbed a thermal tarp from the supply rack, already stiff from the cold, and slung it over his shoulder. His breath came in shallow bursts, but his mind was clear. Every training exercise, every survival documentary, every story of old Arctic explorers flickered in his memory. Those people had no shields, no plasma suits, no alien tech, and they had lived. The difference between them and the cadets here was understanding, not equipment. He moved to the hatch, forcing it open with both hands as frozen seals cracked apart. A blast of air rushed in, and every alien in the room recoiled. The cold outside wasn't just cold, it was alive, a physical force that clawed at exposed skin and filled the ears with endless roaring. Evan stepped through, bracing himself against the gale. Snow sliced through the air like powdered glass. The ground was uneven, the landscape shifting under his boots as the wind rearranged dunes of frozen dust. He pulled a metal rod from his pack and plunged it into the snow, marking the direction of the drift. Then he planted another one 5 meters away. Within minutes, the wind began to carve shallow grooves along their bases, revealing how it flowed. He followed the pattern with his eyes, tracing the invisible currents that shaped this frozen world. Behind him, Sira called out, her voice thin and trembling. "Evan, what are you doing?" He turned his head slightly. "Watching how the world breathes," he replied. To her it made no sense, but to him it was everything. He knelt, scooping a handful of snow and letting it slip through his fingers. The grains were dry and sharp, meaning the temperature was far below freezing. Good for structure, terrible for skin. That meant he could build with it. The realization sparked through him like fire. He marked the direction of the strongest wind and walked 30 paces to where the ground dipped slightly. That hollow would be the start. Inside the dome, the cadets huddled near the dead panels, shivering and staring at him through the frosted glass. He motioned for them to follow, but only 2 obeyed at first. Sira, who moved clumsily on her talons, and the reptilian instructor, whose authority had eroded faster than the dome's power. The rest stayed behind, hoping the promise of rescue would somehow still be true. Evan didn't wait for them. He knelt and began digging into the snow with his gloved hands, carving long trenches that followed the natural slope of the wind's path. The motion was mechanical, rhythmic, and strangely comforting. He remembered watching old documentaries about humans building snow trenches in Antarctic storms, where temperatures could kill a person in minutes if exposed. Those trenches weren't shelters in the traditional sense. They were heat traps, narrow enough to block wind and deep enough to preserve the warmth of bodies. If he could get everyone inside such trenches before nightfall, they might live. The reptilian instructor tried to help but collapsed after only a few minutes, his scales coated in ice. Evan pulled him into the half-dug trench and wrapped him in the thermal tarp. "Stay still," he said. "Your core temperature will even out faster that way." The instructor blinked, the frost thick around his eyes, and whispered, "Humans shouldn't be here. Your body isn't made for this." Evan smiled faintly. "Neither is yours. The difference is I don't expect it to be." He stood again, continuing to carve. His fingers ached, his knuckles burned, but every scoop of snow gave him more control over the environment that sought to kill him. The trench deepened. The wind's bite softened near the base. Sira crouched beside him, following his movements, mimicking his motions as best she could with her claws. Her feathers rattled, but her eyes steadied. For the first time since the heater failed, she stopped trembling. Hours passed like that, measured not by time, but by the rhythm of shoveling, packing, and shaping. When Evan finally looked up, the storm had settled into a steady howl. The dome was half buried now, a ghostly silhouette against the snow. The rest of the cadets were still inside, and their survival depended on whether they believed him before the next sunset. He knew that once he finished the first trench, he could use its shelter to expand and connect others. It would become a network, a system, not chaos. That was what survival truly meant, turning panic into pattern. He brushed snow from his visor and looked at the horizon, though there was nothing to see beyond the endless storm. For a moment he felt utterly alone, but not afraid. The cold was not an enemy, only a teacher with cruel lessons. He would listen, learn, and act, the human way. When he returned to the dome entrance, he knocked 3 times on the metal frame to get attention. The sound echoed like a drumbeat. One by one, shapes moved inside, hesitant and weary. "It's ready," he said simply. "Come out, and bring what you can carry. Blankets, thermal gel, anything that burns." His voice carried the quiet conviction of someone who had already chosen life. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sira stepped forward, followed by the insectoid cadet who had mocked him earlier. The rest followed in silence. As the first of them stepped into the trench and felt the stillness of air inside it, the fear in their eyes dimmed. The dome that had promised protection had failed. But here, carved from snow and willpower, stood the beginning of something that could save them all. And in that moment, under the screaming wind, the human looked up and whispered to himself, "We start here." The storm had dulled to a constant roar by the time Evan stood again above the trench. The wind carried a low, steady hum that vibrated in his ribs like a drumbeat, a reminder that Illyria 7 was still deciding whether it would let them live. Around him, shapes moved faintly in the gray light, alien cadets dragging supplies from the half-buried dome, their silhouettes blurred by blowing snow. The human's eyes narrowed behind his frost-coated visor. He watched the direction of drifting particles, tracing how the gusts shifted from one side of the ridge to another. There was rhythm in the chaos, a pulse hidden beneath the noise. He called that pattern the invisible rivers, and learning to read them was the difference between freezing to death and waking to a new dawn. He knelt beside one of his markers, the metal rod he had plunged into the snow earlier. The wind scoured the base of it clean, revealing how air currents twisted around obstacles before slamming into the trench wall. Every contour mattered. Every rise and fall of the terrain redirected the invisible rivers of cold. The cadets behind him were still learning to move through the storm without stumbling. He heard Sira's talons scrape against the trench's frozen edge, followed by the rasp of the reptilian instructor's breathing. They were alive, but only barely. Evan turned toward them and gestured to the metal rods. "You see how the snow builds up here?" he asked, his voice muffled by his rebreather. "That's where the wind slows. It drops what it carries. If we build shelters there, they'll get buried. We build where the wind keeps sweeping clean." Sira blinked rapidly, her feathers trembling as frost clung to them. "You're mapping the air," she said slowly, her voice carrying disbelief more than understanding. Evan nodded once. "The air moves like water," he said. "It flows, eddies, and breaks. You can't stop it, but you can make it serve you if you listen." The reptilian instructor gave a low, doubtful growl, but said nothing. His eyes, reptilian and sharp, followed the human's gestures, as though trying to decipher the logic of what seemed like madness. Evan began moving along the ridgeline, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. He jabbed another rod into the ground, then another, marking how each gust curved between them. He used small strips of fabric torn from a damaged tarp to see how the wind twisted when it met resistance. It was primitive, yes, but it worked better than any malfunctioning alien scanner. The ribbons fluttered in strange unison, bending toward a narrow corridor between 2 ridges. He crouched and examined the area, scraping snow away with his gloves until his fingers brushed hard ice. The surface was smooth, sculpted by countless storms. It was the perfect place to carve new trenches, low enough to escape direct gusts, but open enough for ventilation. Behind him, the insectoid cadet clicked his mandibles impatiently. "Why waste time studying wind when we could be building?" he demanded. His voice carried a brittle edge, half fear and half pride. Evan turned and looked at him quietly. The silence stretched long enough for the insectoid to shift his stance uneasily. "Because if we build in the wrong place," Evan said at last, "you'll wake up under 3 meters of snow instead of under the stars." He turned back to the ridge without waiting for a reply. Arguments were wasted energy, and energy was life. He began carving shapes into the snow with a metal tool, circles, arrows, and lines connecting them. It looked like a child's drawing, but to him it was a map of survival. The aliens gathered around, watching with a mix of confusion and fascination as he sketched the currents they couldn't see. The avian cadet tilted her head, following his markings, and murmured, "It's like music, patterns repeating." Evan smiled faintly. "Exactly," he said. "And once you hear the rhythm, you can move with it." As he worked, the temperature continued to drop. The air burned when he inhaled, and his lashes froze together whenever he blinked. His fingers had gone numb long ago, but he could still feel the resistance of the snow against his palms, the sharp texture of ice that threatened to slice through fabric. Sierra stumbled beside him and caught herself on one of the rods, her body trembling from cold. He reached out and steadied her. "Keep moving," he said softly. "The moment you stop, the cold wins." She nodded, her breath forming clouds that were instantly stolen by the wind. An hour passed. The light above dimmed until the sky turned from gray to silver blue, the color of Illyria 7's endless dusk. Evan had finished mapping most of the immediate area. His rods and flags formed a jagged line across the snow, tracing where the wind's power ebbed and surged. He crouched beside one of the trenches and brushed frost from the top of his portable reader, checking the environmental data. The numbers confirmed what he already knew. The storm was losing force but gaining cold. The winds would slow just enough for the temperature to plummet below survivable limits. That meant one thing: build now or die before morning. He rose and gathered the cadets closer, his voice sharp and steady despite the wind. "The storm's breaking," he said. "But when it does, it'll get colder. We'll have 6 hours of calm before the next front hits. We use it to dig. The wind flows northeast, so we'll align the trenches along that line. Every turn and pocket we make will trap heat instead of losing it." His words carried weight, not because of authority, but because of certainty. The cadets listened, their fear slowly shifting into focus. The insectoid moved first, stabbing his limbs into the snow to dig. The amphibians followed, using their webbed hands to scoop and pat the snow into dense blocks. Sierra worked beside Evan, cutting drifts into sections that could form walls. The human showed her how to stack them so each layer sealed the cracks of the one below it, creating insulation through compression. It was old knowledge, passed down from explorers who had lived in endless winters. The others soon mimicked the rhythm, each movement synchronized to the storm's steady breath. For the first time since the heaters died, there was purpose. As the trenches deepened, Evan took short breaks to reassess the wind lines. He placed his palm flat against the surface and felt the air slip across it, noting how the current had changed since they altered the landscape. The snowdrifts now flowed differently, forming new channels around the structures they'd made. The invisible rivers were being redirected, shaped by their work. It was like watching nature itself bend slightly under the will of the living. He almost smiled at the thought. Humans had always been small compared to the worlds they inhabited, but they learned early how to make the world move around them instead of waiting for mercy. Hours passed until the trenches formed a crude network, angled walls and narrow corridors that broke the wind's force into whispers. The air within them was still frigid, but no longer deadly. Sierra collapsed to her knees beside one wall, breathing heavily. Her feathers were coated in frost, but her eyes were alive again. "It's working," she whispered. Evan crouched beside her. "Not yet," he said. "It's surviving, not living. But it's a start." He pressed his glove to the trench wall and felt faint warmth from their combined movement. It wasn't much, but it was proof that they could turn death into shelter. The reptilian instructor stood at the edge of the structure, staring out into the blizzard. His scales reflected the dull light of the storm, and for the first time, his posture showed something close to humility. "You read the storm like a book," he said quietly, his voice rough. "How does a human learn this?" Evan looked at him, snow swirling around his helmet. "By freezing," he said simply. "By failing, until you remember what the cold is trying to teach you." The instructor nodded once, his breath fogging against the air, and said nothing more. When the last trench was complete, Evan climbed to the highest ridge to survey the work. The dome was almost invisible now, buried under snow, but in its place stretched a network of narrow passageways, half hidden beneath the drifts. The invisible rivers of air no longer screamed across the plain. They bent and split, weaving between the new walls. The landscape itself had changed. The cadets below him moved with exhaustion, yet their movements carried a quiet determination. They no longer looked like a group of stranded students. They looked like survivors. He raised his eyes to the horizon. The wind shifted again, this time slower, almost gentle. The storm was indeed breaking, just as he had predicted. Beyond the ridges, the faint glow of Illyria's twin moons broke through the thinning clouds. Their light reflected off the snow, casting everything in a soft, blue radiance. It was almost beautiful. Evan drew a slow breath, feeling his lungs burn with the cold. He could not feel his fingers anymore, but the ache was a reminder that he was still alive. He descended back into the trenches, moving from one group to another, checking the walls for weaknesses. Sierra was tending to the amphibian cadets, wrapping their limbs in strips of insulation. The insectoid was reinforcing a wall with his claws, carving grooves that held snow blocks tighter. The reptilian instructor oversaw the effort in silence. Evan paused near the central corridor, where heat from movement was strongest. He pressed his hand against the wall again and smiled faintly when frost melted beneath his touch. When he finally allowed himself to rest, he sat in the lee of a trench wall and stared at the flickering light of the auroras forming above the storm. The invisible rivers had revealed themselves at last, not only in the wind, but in the lives of the ones who had chosen to follow him. The dome had promised safety and failed. The storm had promised death and taught instead. Somewhere beyond the ice, dawn waited. But for now, the human listened to the wind hum across the ridges, quiet and alive, like breath in a sleeping world. Evan awoke to the sound of silence. It was not the peaceful kind, but a silence thick with weight, the kind that settles after the storm has said everything it needed to say. The wind outside had weakened, but its absence only made the cold sharper. He opened his eyes to the dim blue light that filtered through the snow above the trench roof. Frost had formed on the inside of his visor in delicate patterns that looked like feathers of ice. He sat up slowly, his muscles aching from the night's labor. Around him, the cadets stirred one by one, their movements sluggish but alive. Sierra was the first to stand, brushing frost from her feathers, her golden eyes catching the faint light. The insectoid cadet crouched by the trench wall, inspecting the frozen surface as if it were a piece of machinery. The reptilian instructor leaned silently against a snow block, his breath visible in small, steady clouds. Evan's body ached with exhaustion, but his mind was already working. The trench network had done its job through the night. It kept the wind out and preserved enough warmth to let them sleep. But this was only the beginning. The air would drop further once the sun reached its zenith, and the stillness would turn deadly without movement. They needed to transform their fragile shelter into something more permanent, something that could hold heat instead of merely resist the cold. The human climbed out of the trench and stood on the ridge. From above, the snow city was barely visible, a series of shallow scars in the white plain. It wasn't a city yet, but he would make it one. He began his inspection by walking along the outermost trench, marking weak points where snow had collapsed overnight. His breath created small clouds that froze and vanished. Each step crunched through the crust, echoing softly in the still air. He stopped near one of the vents the amphibian cadets had carved the day before. The edges had sealed over with frost, trapping the stale air inside the lower corridors. He crouched and dug the opening wider. A faint rush of trapped heat rose to his face, carrying the smell of damp insulation and chemical gel. It was proof that warmth could be contained. It just needed direction. He called out to the group. "We're reinforcing the trenches," he said, his voice firm but calm. "We'll build wind walls and heat pockets. This storm isn't done with us, and the next one will be worse." Sira approached, clutching a bundle of torn tarps she had scavenged from the dome. Her feathers were rimmed with ice, but her eyes burned with quiet determination. "How?" she asked. Evan pointed to the vents. "We trap heat the same way we trap air. We make it move only where we want it." The insectoid cadet clacked his mandibles skeptically. "You speak like the wind is alive," he said. Evan looked at him. "It is," he replied. "And if you don't understand how to live with it, it kills you." The insectoid fell silent. Evan turned to the reptilian instructor. "We'll use the snow blocks from the outer trenches to build higher walls around the inner ones. The structure will redirect airflow and give us a temperature buffer." The instructor nodded, saying nothing. He no longer doubted the human. Evan began cutting blocks of compressed snow using the jagged edge of a broken panel from the dome. The motion was mechanical, almost meditative. Slice, lift, stack, repeat. Each block weighed nearly as much as a small pack, but the cold made his arms numb enough that he barely felt the strain. The others soon followed his lead, forming a chain to pass the blocks along. The amphibians used their wide hands to smooth the surfaces, sealing the gaps with slush that froze instantly. Sira climbed the outer wall, her claws anchoring in the snow, placing the uppermost layers like bricks. The insectoid reinforced them with icicle-like rods secreted from his limbs, hardening them into translucent supports. The structure began to rise, walls bending in curved arcs, the trenches below turning into narrow corridors that felt almost architectural. As the work continued, Evan adjusted their alignment according to the wind's direction. He could feel the faint pressure of air moving past his helmet, the subtlest vibrations against his cheek. The invisible rivers were flowing again, but this time through channels of his own design. Each new wall diverted the current just enough to create calm pockets between them. When the wind shifted, it whistled softly through the vents instead of howling across open ground. The sound was eerie yet comforting, a sign that the storm now obeyed a different rhythm. By midday, the snow city had taken shape. The trenches formed concentric patterns like a labyrinth, each layer deeper than the last, each wall catching the sun's weak rays and reflecting them in pale blue light. In the center, Evan built what he called the core, a low pit lined with thermal gel containers and covered by a lattice of tarp and snow. The heat collected there radiated slowly through the air, trapped beneath the curved walls. Sira stood beside him, watching the faint steam rise. "It feels warmer," she said. "Because it is," he answered. "Heat moves the same way air does. It looks for paths. We just made it take the long way out." The reptilian instructor crouched near the central pit, testing the surface with his claw. "You're turning snow into architecture," he said. "Into purpose." Evan shrugged. "That's what humans do. We build meaning out of whatever tries to kill us." The instructor looked at him thoughtfully, the corners of his scaled mouth twitching in what might have been the alien version of a smile. As the others fortified the outer walls, Evan moved to the perimeter and began marking new paths for airflow. He drove thin rods into the snow, bending them to indicate how the next storm's pressure would move. Each adjustment mattered. Each line could mean the difference between survival and collapse. The wind had softened enough now that the air carried faint sounds from beyond the ridge, the distant cracking of ice, the creak of settling snowfields. The planet itself was alive, shifting beneath them. The cadets were working with renewed focus. The amphibians hummed low rhythmic tones as they packed snow, the sound vibrating through the trenches like a heartbeat. The insectoid clicked in quick bursts to coordinate the lifting of heavier blocks. Sierra glided between groups, her movements elegant despite exhaustion, guiding others with calm gestures. Evan observed in silence, his chest tightening with a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pride or relief, perhaps something closer to wonder. He had seen groups work together before, but never like this. These cadets came from worlds that barely tolerated each other's existence, yet here, in the face of Illyria 7's indifference, they had become one organism. Hours later, when the light began to fade again, the first signs of true warmth appeared. The frost on the inner walls melted slightly, forming droplets that froze again in thin, glassy layers. The temperature had risen enough to make breathing less painful. The cadets gathered in the central corridor, their faces faintly illuminated by the red glow of chemical flares embedded in the walls. Evan crouched near the vent, holding his gloved hand above the heat pocket. "See," he said quietly. "This place breathes now. The air moves through it. It's alive." Sierra leaned closer, her feathers catching the soft light. "It's beautiful," she murmured. The insectoid hissed softly in agreement, his tone no longer skeptical. Evan stood, scanning the structure. The network of trenches, walls, and vents connected seamlessly now, forming a true system. A city carved not from ambition, but from necessity. It was crude, temporary, and fragile, yet it carried the unmistakable signature of human design. Adaptability, born of desperation. He felt the exhaustion in his bones, but he also felt the pulse of accomplishment. For the first time since the storm began, he believed they might all survive the next night. He returned to the highest ridge to take one last look before darkness swallowed the horizon. The moons had risen, painting the snowfield in twin shades of blue and silver. The city below shimmered faintly, its curves catching the light in soft halos. He could see movement, shadows passing through corridors, the subtle flicker of flares beneath the snow. From above, it looked like veins of warmth glowing inside a frozen heart. He smiled behind his visor. As he stood there, a faint vibration traveled through the ground. He froze, listening. It was not wind. It was something deeper, a low rumble that pulsed like distant thunder. The reptilian instructor climbed up beside him, his scales reflecting the moonlight. "The ice fields are shifting," he said quietly. "The cold moves the ground like tides." Evan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then we'll move with it," he replied. The instructor looked at him, and for the first time, there was no trace of condescension, only respect. When Evan descended again, the others had begun to settle into the inner trenches. He moved through the narrow passages, checking on each group. Sierra sat near the core, warming her hands above the thermal pit. The amphibians were half submerged in blankets, their translucent skin glowing faintly from inner bioluminescence. The insectoid watched over them in silence, his antennae twitching at every shift in the air. Evan crouched beside Sierra. "Keep an eye on the vents," he said softly. "If the wind reverses, it could draw heat out instead of in." She nodded. "I will." He leaned back against the wall, letting the sound of soft breathing fill the corridor. The city of snow was holding, fragile, imperfect, but holding. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint hum of air moving through the vents, the heartbeat of what they had built. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the next storm, the risk of collapse, the cold that never truly slept. But tonight, for the first time, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. Above the trenches, the auroras shimmered again, green and violet waves rippling across the black sky. The invisible rivers flowed in silence, bending around the shapes carved by human hands. Illyria 7 watched from above, cold and endless, but the world had changed. In the heart of the storm, a new kind of warmth had taken root. The city of the cold was alive. The second night came faster than anyone expected. The pale sun sank behind the frozen ridges, leaving the sky washed in violet and steel blue, and with it came the deep, bone-cracking chill that had no mercy for the living. The wind was quieter now, but quieter on Illyria 7 never meant safer. It only meant the cold had taken control. The storm's fury had been replaced by silence so absolute that the smallest breath echoed through the trench corridors. Evan knew that silence was dangerous. It meant the temperature had dropped to levels where even sound struggled to move through the air. He could feel it in his chest, each inhale a sharp reminder that his lungs were made for a kinder world. He walked through the narrow passages of the Snow City, inspecting the walls with his gloved hand. The surfaces were smooth, almost glass-like now, hardened by the freezing night. The air inside the trenches was still holding warmth from the thermal pit, but only barely. The chemical flares embedded in the walls had burned through most of their charge, leaving the corridors dimly lit by dull red glows that looked like dying embers under ice. He paused near one of the central vents and brushed away a thin crust of frost, peering inside. The airflow had slowed, which meant the outer openings were beginning to freeze shut. If that continued, the trapped gases from the thermal gel could build up pressure and explode. Sierra approached quietly behind him, her wings tucked close to her body for insulation. "The others are exhausted," she said, her voice muffled through her mask. "The amphibians can hardly move. Their bodies are shutting down." Evan turned toward her, his eyes unreadable behind the frost-covered visor. "They need heat," he said simply. "Not just warmth, something steady." He looked at the pit ahead, where the remnants of the earlier gel mixture flickered weakly. "The chemical flares won't last another hour." The reptilian instructor emerged from the shadows, his scales coated in frost that glittered like silver. "We have no new gel," he said. "No fuel. The cargo packs are empty." Evan shook his head. Not empty, just overlooked. He crouched beside the nearest wall and began scraping off the thin layer of ice that sealed the snow blocks together. "There's air trapped in here," he said. "Moisture, carbon, bits of thermal residue from the vents. We can use it." The instructor frowned. "Use the snow itself?" Evan nodded. "Snow is water. Water is fuel, if you make it listen." He retrieved one of the empty gel canisters from the pit and scraped its metallic surface clean. Then he poured a small amount of residue from another cracked container into it, mixing it with melted frost from the wall. Sierra watched him, her feathers quivering. "You're going to light it again?" she asked, disbelief coloring her voice. Evan smiled faintly. "Not light. Wake it." He reached into his suit pouch and pulled out a silver ignition chip, a small device used for signaling distress beacons. "This chip creates a spark hot enough to melt composite alloys. If I focus it on the mix, it should trigger a chemical chain reaction." He crouched low, shielding the canister from the draft. His gloves trembled slightly as he adjusted the chip, aligning it with the container's rim. When he activated the spark, a brief flash of light burst forth, followed by a sharp hiss. The mixture inside the canister began to bubble violently, releasing a faint mist that glowed in pale blue. Evan covered it with a piece of fractured dome glass, trapping the heat. Within seconds, the snow beneath his knees began to melt in small rivulets that hissed against the cold air. The temperature in the trench rose by several degrees. Sierra's eyes widened in awe. "It's working." Evan nodded, the faintest smile touching his lips. "It's not a fire," he said, "but it's the next best thing." He motioned for the others to bring their empty containers. The amphibian cadets, sluggish from cold, moved forward with visible effort, their translucent skin glimmering faintly under the red light. The insectoid carried several cracked vessels in his arms, his movements mechanical but precise. Evan worked quickly, mixing frost, gel residue, and snow together in careful ratios. Every batch he produced released a steady, low heat when sealed and sparked. Soon, the entire core trench was lined with small, glowing containers, each one humming faintly like a living heart. the air filled with a thin vapor that diffused warmth evenly, softening the sharp edges of the cold. The reptilian instructor watched silently from the corner, his yellow eyes reflecting the light of the makeshift heaters. "You're turning the cold into warmth," he said quietly. Evan didn't look up. "No," he said. "I'm just reminding it that it can be both." The instructor tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the words, then crouched beside one of the containers. He pressed his claw gently against the glass lid and pulled it back immediately, startled. "It burns," he said. Evan nodded. "That means it's alive." As the hours passed, the snow city began to change. The air grew humid, thin tendrils of steam curling along the trench walls. Frost melted in delicate veins that sparkled under the flare light. The temperature stabilized above freezing for the first time since their arrival. The cadets removed parts of their masks to breathe more easily, exhaling visible clouds that no longer vanished instantly. Sierra sat near the central pit, her feathers finally relaxing. "It smells strange," she murmured. "Like wet stone." Evan nodded. "That's the scent of survival." When he finally allowed himself to rest, he sat beside the pit and leaned his back against the wall. His body felt heavy, every muscle burning from fatigue, but his mind was still sharp. He watched the glowing containers flicker like stars caught beneath the ice. The others had begun to doze, their bodies pressed close for warmth. The reptilian instructor sat opposite him, still awake. His posture was rigid, but his expression had softened. "In all my years of teaching," he said, "I've never seen a cadet take command like this. You've turned panic into structure, fear into discipline." Evan's voice was quiet but steady. "It's not command. It's cooperation. That's how we survived on Earth long before we had technology, by trusting what each person could do." The instructor studied him for a long moment, then inclined his head. "Perhaps that's what makes your kind dangerous," he said. "You find strength in unity, even when the universe offers none." Evan gave a faint smile. "Or maybe we just get bored of dying." A sudden sound interrupted their conversation, a sharp, rhythmic crack from above. Evan froze, listening. The sound came again, deeper this time. The roof of the trench trembled slightly, a few snowflakes falling from the ceiling. The instructor stood quickly. "The ice above is shifting," he said. Evan pushed himself up, moving toward the nearest exit. He climbed the narrow slope, his boots digging into the packed snow until he reached the surface. The landscape beyond the city was transforming. Under the faint light of the moons, massive sheets of ice were moving slowly across the plain, creaking like old wood. Fissures opened and closed in the distance, releasing pillars of frost that shimmered like smoke. It was the planet breathing again after the storm. He stood there for a long moment, watching the beauty and danger intertwine. The air above the horizon glowed faintly green from the auroras. Below, the snow city exhaled faint plumes of vapor through its vents, glowing red and blue in the moonlight. It looked alive, as if the planet itself had grown a heartbeat beneath the ice. He turned and climbed back down, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of the walls. Inside the trench, the heat was holding strong. Sierra had fallen asleep near the pit, her feathers puffed for insulation. The amphibians were breathing more evenly now, their skin no longer brittle from the cold. The insectoid stood guard near the entrance, his reflective eyes scanning the corridor for movement. Evan nodded to him in acknowledgement, then knelt to check one of the heaters. The glass had cracked slightly, releasing a thin trail of blue mist. He adjusted the lid, resealing it. The soft hum returned. He sat back and looked around at what they had built. The fire beneath the frost, born not from flame, but from persistence. Every wall, every vent, every small spark was proof that survival was an act of creation, not resistance. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The silence outside no longer felt like a threat, but a pause between breaths. The storm would return eventually, as it always did, but for now, they had carved out a place where life could exist. The reptilian instructor approached him quietly. "When this trial ends," he said, "the Academy will have to rewrite its manuals. The dome failed, but this endured." Evan looked up at him. "Then maybe they'll finally understand that survival isn't about comfort. It's about adaptation." The instructor nodded. "And about those who can teach it." Evan looked into the glowing pit one last time. The mist danced upward like smoke, twisting toward the ceiling before fading into the air. He reached out and placed his hand against the snow wall. It was warm to the touch. He smiled faintly, exhaustion settling deep into his limbs. "We built fire out of ice," he murmured. "Now we just have to keep it alive until morning." Outside, the auroras pulsed softly across the sky, reflecting in the ice and snow. The world beyond was still frozen, still cruel, but inside the trenches, something ancient had been reborn, the defiance that lived in every human heart, the quiet promise that warmth could be made anywhere if one only refused to give up. The first sign of dawn came not as light, but as sound, a low, distant hum that rippled through the frozen plain like the planet's heartbeat. Evan stirred from his half-sleep, his body stiff, but his mind alert. The air inside the trenches was warmer now, almost breathable without filters. The makeshift heaters still glowed faintly, their soft blue light shimmering through the thin mist of vapor that hung in the corridors. He rose slowly, stretching his aching arms, and looked around at the sleeping cadets. The reptilian instructor was slumped against the wall, his chin resting on his chest, his breath slow and steady. Sira slept beside the thermal pit, her feathers spread out in a wide, protective arc over two of the amphibian cadets who had curled beneath her wings for warmth. The insectoid stood half awake near the entrance, his posture rigid, but his movements sluggish. Evan felt a flicker of pride at the sight. The city of snow had held through the second night, something no one had believed possible when the dome first failed. He climbed quietly toward the surface, careful not to disturb the others. The snow above the vent had hardened overnight, forming a thin crust that cracked under his weight as he pushed it aside. A burst of frigid air hit his face, but it no longer felt like an enemy. He pulled himself out onto the ridge and looked around. The horizon was a faint line of silver, stretching endlessly beneath the pale sky. Illyria-7's twin suns had not yet risen, but their light pressed faintly against the clouds, painting them in soft gold and gray. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a landscape reshaped by wind and will. The snow city spread beneath him in intricate patterns, rings and trenches glowing faintly from within, alive with trapped heat and light. From above, it looked like veins running through ice, a heartbeat carved into the planet's skin. He stood there for a long moment, letting the silence fill him. The air smelled faintly metallic, touched by frost and distant minerals. He could almost hear the hum of frozen rivers shifting under the crust. Illyria-7 was still dangerous, still alive, but it had accepted their presence for now. He tilted his head upward, watching as the first rays of light broke over the ridge. The suns rose together, one pale and one amber, their overlapping halos scattering through the ice crystals in the air. The light poured across the plain, washing the snow in gold. The trenches below caught it, refracting it through the thin frost, until the entire structure shimmered like glass. For the first time since the exercise began, the world looked gentle. Behind him, Sira's voice broke the silence. "You should sleep," she said softly. He turned and saw her climbing out of the trench, her feathers glistening with frost. Her eyes were tired but bright. He smiled faintly. "I'll sleep when the suns are higher," he said. "We made it through the worst." She joined him on the ridge, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "It doesn't feel real," she said, looking out over the landscape. "When the dome failed, I thought it was the end." Evan nodded. "It was supposed to be." That's what the trial was designed for, to break us down until we either adapt or give up. He looked down at the glowing trenches. We didn't give up. The reptilian instructor emerged next, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood beside Evan, his scales glinting in the twin sunlight. "Rescue ships will come soon," he said. "They must have detected the dome's failure." Evan nodded. "They'll find us alive. That's enough." The instructor looked at him with something that might have been pride. "More than enough," he said. As the suns climbed higher, the air began to warm slightly. Steam rose from the vents, forming faint spirals that caught the light. The insectoid and amphibian cadets appeared, blinking in the brightness, their faces filled with awe as they took in the transformed world. The cold that had once been their enemy now gleamed like polished silver, and the city they had carved from it stood defiant and beautiful. Sierra walked along the edge of one trench, running her clawed fingers over the smooth snow. "It's like a living thing," she said. "It breathes." Evan smiled. "It does. The wind moves through it, the heat circulates, the walls expand and settle. It's not a shelter anymore. It's a system." The reptilian instructor gave a slow nod. "You made nature your ally." Evan looked at him. "I listened to it. That's all." A low vibration rolled through the air again, different from the rumble of the ice fields. This one had rhythm, mechanical and controlled. Evan turned toward the horizon and saw a faint glimmer of light moving through the sky. It grew larger by the second, splitting into 2, then 4. The rescue ships were descending, their sleek forms cutting through the clouds like shards of metal. The cadets began to cheer weakly, their exhaustion breaking for a moment into relief. Sierra pressed her hands together, her breath visible in the sunlight. "They're coming," she whispered. Evan nodded, his expression calm. "Let's show them what survival looks like." Within minutes, the ships hovered above the plain, their engines scattering snow in slow, spiraling waves. The lead craft lowered its landing struts near the ridge, kicking up frost as it settled. The door opened, and a team of instructors stepped out, their heavy suits gleaming under the suns. One of them, a tall insectoid officer with crystalline armor, looked around in visible disbelief. His gaze moved from the buried remains of the dome to the intricate trenches glowing softly beneath the snow. "You built this?" he asked, his tone sharp with astonishment. The reptilian instructor stepped forward. "He built it," he said, nodding toward Evan. The officer turned his gaze to the human, eyes narrowing behind his visor. "Without power? Without tools?" Evan met his stare evenly. "With what was left," he said simply. The officer walked to the edge of one trench, running a hand along the smooth wall. The heat rising from below made his breath fog instantly. "You turned snow into insulation," he said slowly. "Redirected airflow, stabilized temperature gradients." He looked back at Evan, his expression unreadable. "This wasn't survival. This was engineering." Evan said nothing. The officer studied him for another long moment, then inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect. "The Academy will want to see this," he said. "You've rewritten the test." As the rescue crew began assisting the cadets aboard the ships, Evan lingered at the edge of the ridge, watching the city below. The sunlight continued to dance across the ice, glinting off the trenches in soft waves. Sierra approached him one last time, her feathers catching the light like strands of gold. "When you go back," she said quietly, "what will you tell them?" He looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "That the dome didn't fail," he said. "It just stopped pretending to protect us. The world out there was always waiting. We just needed to listen." She smiled faintly. "And will you come back?" He paused, then shook his head. "Maybe not here. But there will always be another place that needs rebuilding." She held his gaze for a moment longer before stepping back toward the waiting ships. The reptilian instructor stood by the ramp, watching Evan with a mix of admiration and quiet understanding. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "You've shown us that control isn't strength, adaptation is." Evan gave a small nod. "Maybe that's what survival really means." The instructor extended his hand, scaled and scarred, and Evan clasped it firmly. He turned once more to look at the city of snow. The heat from the trenches created shimmering distortions in the air, making the structures appear almost alive. In a few hours, the rescue team would dismantle it, record the data, and leave. The wind would reclaim the plain, filling the trenches, erasing every trace of their presence. But Evan knew that erasure didn't mean loss. The lesson had already been written, into the minds of those who lived it, and into the cold itself, which had taught him more than any instructor could. As he climbed the ramp into the ship, the engines began to hum louder. The snow swirled around him, rising like white smoke. Through the small window beside his seat, he watched the landscape fade into distance. The city below disappeared beneath drifting powder, its glow dimming until it was only memory. Above, the suns blazed higher, scattering the last of the frost into the air. The reptilian instructor sat across from him, his voice calm. "What will you call it? This technique?" Evan looked out the window, watching the endless expanse of white. "The human method of adaptive engineering," he said after a pause. "But I think it's simpler than that." The instructor raised an eyebrow. Evan smiled faintly. "It's just common sense." As the ship rose higher, the snow plains stretched beneath them, endless and untouched. The wind carried over the scars they had left, filling them in, smoothing the surface until the world was whole again. Illyria 7 returned to its silence. Yet somewhere beneath that silence the echo of warmth remained, the memory of a city built from cold, and of a human who had listened to the storm until it spoke back.